Now, just to be clear, LBJ's Great Society had and still has its detractors, people who believe his big government programs did more harm than good. But my former boss thought otherwise.
Half a century later, the laws LBJ passed are now as fundamental to our conception of ourselves and our democracy as the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
I'm Melody Barnes. As President Obama's Director of Domestic Policy, I saw just how difficult it is to move the needle on anything of real importance. And yet, Lyndon Johnson did just that, over and over on a scale that today seems unimaginable. My White House experience left me with an itch to know more about LBJ and how he managed to overcome the enormous forces of resistance and inertia that stand in the way of change.
See if you can get the son of a bitch on the phone.
This podcast, called LBJ and the Great Society, is an effort to understand who Lyndon Johnson was, beyond Vietnam, and how he did what he did.
Johnson got votes by pulling lapels and nose to nose.
God damn it, you need to vote with me once in a while, just one time.
For the most part, you'll hear the story straight from the horse's mouth.
Two, testing,
through the recorded recollections of people who were there, in the room, when this history was being made,
Identify the tape first.
and who had a hand in its making.
This is an interview with Mr. Herbert J.
Interview with Mr.
Kramer.
Jewel M. Sugar. Date is May 14th, 1969.
Coming February 4th, subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts. Well, good morning, everyone. You all are very quiet. We are so happy that you are here with us this morning. My name is Melody Barnes. I'm a professor of practice here at the Miller Center and co-director of the Democracy Initiative here at the University of Virginia. And welcome to our program within a program. It's like, you know, those Russian dolls, and there's one inside the other. As you know, we're going to have a fantastic conversation with some of the most highly regarded scholars of this period of time who have joined me on stage. And at the same time, this ultimately will be edited into the 7th installment of a podcast series that I'm doing. You just heard the trailer for it, called LBJ and the Great Society. That podcast will be distributed by PRX, and it is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. And as you also heard, it will examine how and why LBJ did what he did during that period of the 1960s. And our panel today will give us an opportunity to not only examine some of those questions, but also ask questions about the legacy of the Great Society. So I am thrilled that we're going to have that opportunity and also the opportunity to engage with you. In a minute, I'll introduce the members of the panel very briefly. I know that you received their biographies when you sat down. But before I do, I also want to pause and say a quick thank you. You all heard some of the clips during that trailer. We owe a debt of gratitude to the LBJ Library, but in addition to that, those phone calls were transcribed and annotated by the Presidential Recordings Project that sits right here at the Miller Center. It is a wonderful treasure trove of information. I'm sure historians and political scientists will attest to that. And I want to thank Mark Silverstone. I don't know if he's here in the room. He's waving his hand. Wave it higher, Mark. Mark leads that program. And he and his staff do wonderful work that help us better understand our history and literally hear it from the horse's mouth. So now I want to introduce the members of the panel. Sitting right next to me, we have Julian Zelizer. You can read more about him and his work, but he is the Malcolm Stevenson Forbes Class of 1941 Professor of History and Public Affairs at Princeton University. And sitting to his left is our UVA colleague, Kevin Gaines, who is the Julian Bond Professor of Civil Rights and Social Justice, the Corcoran Department of History, and he's also with the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies here at UVA. And then finally, my Miller Center colleague, Guian McKee, who is an Associate Professor in Presidential Studies at the Miller Center. So please help me welcome them to the stage. I want to start out setting the context a bit. And Julian, I want to ask you the first question. The late 1950s, the Eisenhower administration, America was feeling, as a general matter, confident, bold. We had come out of World War II. As some have said, we had conquered fascism, feeling prosperous and very content. So a few years later, why would LBJ launch the Great Society? And give us a sense of what the Great Society was. It isn't the entire 1960s, so give us a sense of that.
Well, thanks for having me, and it's wonderful to be here. And I'll echo the point that the tapes really are a marvelous piece of historical material, so it's just great what you guys have produced. It is a decade where the economy is doing well. Overall, the sense of great expectations, grand expectations, as one historian said, is very strong. But there's a lot of unfinished business. So for Lyndon Johnson as a politician who cut his teeth in the New Deal period, there were many issues that FDR had not been able to address, or Harry Truman, such as health care, that he was very eager as Senate Majority Leader and then, more importantly, as President, to finish. There was also a cohort of people in Congress, which we often forget about. Senator Paul Douglas from Illinois, for example, or Jacob Javits of New York, in both parties, liberal lions who were taking on the leadership and thought that Congress had actually become pretty dysfunctional and was not dealing with questions such as health care, civil rights, and other matters. And finally, most important, by the end of the 50s and the early 60s, you have a civil rights movement that is placing immense pressure from the bottom up on our political leaders to address the questions that economic growth wasn't addressing, such as racial inequality and racial brutality throughout the country. And so all these are pressures building even in this decade where everything seems great from the surface. And the Great Society, quickly, and we'll talk about it, will encompass a whole set of programs that comes together in Johnson's presidency: civil rights, health care, federal aid for education, environmental programs, and even money for the arts and much, much more. So we can go through them, but it's a set of actual legislative accomplishments between 64 and 66 is really kind of the end. When it starts to trail off, they'll continue, where you have this huge legislative output, which today, and as someone who's been in the White House can attest to, seems phenomenal that Congress could do so much in such a short period of time.
Yeah, when I look at that list, I am still, it's almost jaw-dropping to me, because it isn't just the sheer number, but also the scope and the scale that move through as Great Society legislation. I don't know, Kevin or Guian, if you have anything you want to add to that.
Well, I think that the civil rights issue was really sort of rising to the center of the national conversation, and really during the Cold War having an adverse impact on the image of the United States abroad. And so Eisenhower was compelled to address it against his will with the Little Rock crisis of 1957. And I think Johnson understood that if he wanted to accomplish this ambitious agenda of social legislation, he was going to have to resolve with that issue of civil rights.
I would just speak to the larger concept of the Great Society, because it is, on the one hand, this collection of ambitious public programs that Congress passes, but there actually is a unifying theme in Johnson's mind, the mind of his advisors. And we really see that spelled out in the spring of 1964 in a commencement address that he gives at the University of Michigan, where he talks about how the challenge of American society in this new prosperous era is no longer the challenge of the New Deal, one that he says was a challenge of quantity, where would people have enough to eat? Would they have housing? Would the economy grow sufficiently to sustain the American dream? It's now a challenge of quality. The quality of American life. What are our schools like? Do our people receive adequate health care? Can our cities be rebuilt? And I think that's the larger vision that Johnson very much believed in. All of the politics and the maneuvering aside, there actually was something deeper that was driving Lyndon Johnson during this period.
And Guian, I want to pick up on something. You were kind of going through that list, and healthcare was an issue that you mentioned, and it seems as though the healthcare fight is always with the United States. And LBJ took on Medicare. And in fact, he lost round one prior to the election. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what animated him to take this on. Other presidents had tried and failed. Kennedy had, presidents prior to Kennedy had. Why did he try? And what has that meant to the healthcare battle that we've seen take shape in the 50 years after he passed Medicare?
As Julian alluded to in his opening remarks, I think you really need to go back to the New Deal for this. And FDR and his team made a decision not to include national health insurance in the Social Security Act in 1935. They did that for a variety of reasons. Namely, they already realized that they would face adamant opposition from the American Medical Association, the primary physicians' professional organization, and who were already organizing against the concept. It was also simply a lower priority for FDR than things like unemployment insurance or old age insurance and assistance. So they held it off. FDR raised it again in 1944 in his Economic Bill of Rights speech in the State of the Union that year. And then after his death, Harry Truman picks it up and loses badly on this twice. And what you see over the following decade then is a kind of pragmatic narrowing of the liberal goals in healthcare. And Julian writes extensively about this in his first book in particular, to focus just on the elderly. You know, that this is a sympathetic group. They're not being covered by the private employment-based health insurance system that springs up during these years. And for Johnson, this is an opportunity to meet one of those issues of quality of American life, and also to both fulfill his mentor FDR's legacy, but also to transcend it. You know, that was always critical to someone with LBJ's ambitions, that he would not just build on FDR, but go beyond him. And this is one of the main points where he can move to do this. It's, of course, a long fight, as Melody alludes to, Melody mentioned. It actually begins even in Congress in the late 50s. And then the 1964 election, of course, is crucial. Landslide for Johnson, large Democratic majorities in the Congress, that they are finally able to push this through. It's an intricate story of what actually happens in Congress even that year and what we get from it. But there are a couple of things to highlight in terms of what Medicare has meant. Obviously, the first thing is simply that this has been immensely beneficial to millions of Americans. The quality of life for the elderly, because at least some of their health care costs are covered by Medicare, has been central. It's become, to this point at least, politically unassailable as a result. But there are other consequences to Medicare and the way that it passes. First of all, and this is something we don't talk enough about, I think, in debates over health care, is that Medicare essentially entrenches the existing healthcare finance system that has grown up in the 30s and 40s. It doesn't challenge that employment-based private system. Not only that, but it builds key features of that system into Medicare, and particularly its reimbursement structures. Costs are reimbursed directly for providers, hospitals, and physicians. Fee-for-service payment survives. And another key point is that there are provisions in the payment rules that are negotiated after the legislation passes to reimburse hospitals for things like their capital costs. This means when they build a new wing or invest in new technology, they can bill for at least a portion of their costs, and even then for the depreciation of those assets over time. And this, on the one hand, allows the wonderful build out of the technology that we all benefit from, but it also kicks off an arms race, because every hospital has to have this technology. They have to compete with the new wing. And this is how you build out the immense complex of the American healthcare system that's now 18% of our GDP. And in this way, these costs become a constraint on all further efforts to expand public coverage. The cost is always at the forefront. And this is not just in Medicare, this is in the system as a whole. It makes it difficult to achieve further reform. And of course, you also then have separated out the most sympathetic group of recipients, the elderly who cannot partake of the private system. So it's a very complex legacy that both generates tremendous benefits for the American people, but also shapes constraints and limitations on what has happened since, right up to the debate that we're having today in the Democratic primary.
You talked about the decision to go forward and a piece at a time. I mean, those conversations, I can tell you, were still happening in 2009 and 2010. I mean, President Obama used to joke with some of my former colleagues, you know, we proceeded the way you'd like us to, we'd cover a pinky, and then we'd cover an elbow, and then we'd cover an arm. And there are debates. I mean, my husband still debates with me about, you know, moving forward and doing something as big as we tried to do. And today we still see the debate that's taking place where people criticize and say, you didn't go far enough. So that, as I said, is a legacy of the larger healthcare debate that this country continues to have.
And it was, I mean, when Medicare was proposed, it really was as radical. Even if it had narrowed to the elderly, it was a pretty radical idea. And, you know, Kennedy actually devotes a huge amount of energy to this, unlike civil rights. He's very committed to, and he has a rally in Madison Square Garden. He's really putting the fire to the feet of the AMA. And he can't get anywhere because the conservative coalition in Congress of Southern Democrats and Republicans is blocking the legislation. And the AMA conducts a furious fight against this. Mm-hmm. You know, going into the districts of members like Wilbur Mills in Arkansas and raising money to cause problems for them. They have signs in doctors' offices which warn patients when they leave that next time they come back, they might be, you know, getting their visit with the government bureaucrat instead of their doctor. They played lowball politics. Ronald Reagan records a record saying this is the opening wedge for socialized medicine, for socialism. Mm-hmm. That there are coffee clutches all over the country where the wives of doctors would play this and kind of build opposition. So when Johnson takes this up, and he takes it up very early, he wants the challenge, actually. Mm-hmm. He says, I'm going to do what Truman was unable to do. It's a pretty risky thing. And once again, though, he really kind of depends, on, in this case, the union movement, which is really putting a lot of resources into counteracting what the AMA is doing and putting political pressure on members. And then the 64 election, it's not just that you have huge Democratic majorities, but a lot of the new members in 64 are elected on pro-Medicare platforms. So the key opponent in the Congress, Wilbur Mills, understands that in January of 65, the game is over. It's about when this is going to pass and what kind of bill is going to pass. And it's that story of electoral pressure, which we often forget in all the great stories of Johnson hovering over people, that's really essential even in a case like Medicare to understand the dynamics of what happened.
Yeah, I mean, you describe it so well, and listening to those tapes were just fascinating because he was pushing and getting pushed, Johnson, getting pushed back. The election happens and the light switch flicks on and those who are against him are lining up to join him. You know, you were talking about pressure, and you mentioned civil rights, and actually, Kevin, I want to turn to you and talk about that. It's another big piece of the Great Society legacy and the work that Lyndon Johnson did to pass those civil rights bills, which is fascinating to me because we know several things about Johnson. He was a Southerner. He understood the South, and he understood its role in the Democratic Party at that time. And for 20 years, he hadn't supported a piece of civil rights legislation up to the 57 bill. We know that he was pragmatic, and we know that he was ambitious. And we also know that he is a student of political power and exercised political prowess, as we've discussed. And in fact, I want to turn to a tape, just a little bit of a clip now before asking you a question. This is a conversation that LBJ is having with his former Senate colleague, his Vice President Hubert Humphrey, just to give you a sense of how he sees political power.
Johnson used to tell me just simply this. He'd say, let me tell you something, Hubert. All this civil rights talk, he said, the thing that we got to do is get those blacks to vote. said, now you fellows are trying to get them public accommodations. You want them to ride in a bus, and he'd go over all the little things. He said, but what they need is the vote. He said, that's what I'm going to get them. When they get the vote power, they got the power.
Now, it's interesting to me, public accommodations, as Humphrey described, he calls them those little things. We're saying Johnson's saying those little things. Setting that aside for a second, his point then, electoral power and what that will mean for the African American community. And Kevin, I wonder if you could just start out by talking about Johnson as a civil rights advocate. I mean, none of us up here are psychologists or psychiatrists, but why do you think he made this pivot and became an advocate for civil rights, starting in '57, but certainly by the time we get to his presidency?
Yeah, it's really hard, I think, to separate Johnson's desire to do the right thing, his recognition that change had to come in the South, and his social compassion that made him take on these issues like healthcare reform and to pursue the Great Society. It's really hard to separate the good motivations in LBJ from his sort of raw political ambition. And Johnson really believed that his very personal, very aggressive use of presidential power could really resolve the racial and social divides of the United States. And you mentioned the 1957 bill, in which Johnson engineers the passage of the first civil rights law, federal law, since Reconstruction. He does this out of pure ambition. I mean, he's got his eye on the 1960 presidential election, and he manages to thread the needle by passing a major civil rights law, but at the same time, a law that really doesn't have very much enforcement teeth. And so he's able to placate his friends and colleagues in the Senate, in the Democratic Party, the so-called Dixiecrats. When he takes the oath of office after the assassination of President Kennedy, it's a much changed environment. We've had years in the late 1950s and early 1960s during the Kennedy administration of domestic and international civil rights crises. Johnson realizes that change and meaningful change, much more significant than what was accomplished in 1957, had to occur. And he really claimed the mantle of the martyred president. Before JFK, before the assassination, he made a speech from the Oval Office calling civil rights a moral issue. And after a lot of sort of temporizing and sort of putting off or downplaying the issue of civil rights, JFK took it up. He supported the March on Washington. And so Johnson realized that he had the opportunity to sort of capitalize on the nation's sort of reverence for JFK's memory and to really sort of push the cause of civil rights through. Bear in mind also in 1963, the nation was roiled by the protests in Birmingham, and to some extent it wasn't just the assassination of JFK, it was the violence that occurred in response to the sort of mass demonstrations in Birmingham and Mississippi that Johnson really sort of felt strengthened his moral leverage to pursue civil rights. You mentioned that Johnson was a Southerner, and Johnson, as a Southerner of his era, was not entirely free of the racial prejudices of fellow Texans and fellow Southerners. But I think Johnson understood that that status and his close relationships and his whole method of working really closely with Congress in achieving civil rights reforms would actually stand him in good stead. It's sort of like someone like Johnson would really have credibility in sort of making sort of ringing endorsements of civil rights and voting rights.
If I could just two things to add to that. I mean, one, Johnson always was very exposed and sensitive to the problem of poverty. And that had racial dimensions in different ways. In the New Deal, when he was heading the National Youth Administration in Texas, he gets money to African American communities kind of quietly and sees the need for improving conditions there. And then the famous story is when he spends some time teaching in a school with Mexican Americans, or Mexicans, and he's kind of deeply affected by what he sees, and he always at least said that helped stimulate his concerns. But the other part of it is his pragmatism and his political fears were often tempered by the movement. The movement really affected him. King's relationship with him is fascinating to hear, and you could hear him learning, like many Americans, and being persuaded as a result of what's happening. And with voting rights, you see it most dramatically in that in early '65, Johnson doesn't want to deal with voting rights. He's in favor of the issue, but it's too soon after the Civil Rights Bill. And he says, we need to postpone this. We need to wait, because if not, I'm not going to get Medicare. I'm not going to get education. And he tells King this all the time. But ultimately, what happens in Selma with the violent response to the protesters and the images of individuals such as John Lewis totally changes his own calculations, changes how he thinks of the issue. He makes that great speech to Congress where he ends it by embracing the words, "we shall overcome," which at the moment for many civil rights activists was amazing to hear a president say that. And so I think the movement really, not just with Selma and voting rights, but throughout, really has an impact and heightens the sense of urgency that he has about dealing with this civil rights question, even though he remains an incredibly problematic figure, not just in using racist language, but being ambivalent about parts of the civil rights agenda that he's kind of dismissive on and never fully, supports.
Yeah.
One other thing I'd add quickly to all that, with which I agree, is there's a strong fear of disorder for Johnson and what the costs politically of disorder might be. Certainly the upheavals in Birmingham, that and other direct movement activities play into that. But also, beginning in 1964, you start to see uprisings in inner city areas in the urban north, and these terrify Johnson. He's lobbying for the war on poverty at the time, and you actually see his pitch change over the spring and summer of 1964. From this is going to be an uplifting, help people pull themselves up by their bootstraps, to we've got to stop the riots. And that only grows as you move through his presidency, that fear that if he is seen as losing control, and that will animate a backlash that could devastate him politically. And that's another motivation for his actions on poverty, on civil rights, on economic policy, that these can stop the rising disorder.
And I think the key word there is control, because Johnson really, while he supported civil rights, he supported it on his own terms. He really felt that the window of opportunity of political capital for passing not only civil rights legislation but the Great Society was going to be really short, and so he really felt that by affecting civil rights legislation and the Great Society, he could basically put the movement out of business and resolve the movement's demands for racial and economic justice, and that would have that sort of pacifying effect on society. So there's a lot of political calculation and hard-nosed politics behind what is essentially a very idealistic vision of social reform and transformation.
And if I could, Kevin just said something really important to Johnson's mindset. We think of Lyndon Johnson as the all-powerful politician, the person who could do anything. President Obama was often asked, why aren't you a little more like Johnson? Lean on people, get things done. He's the magic man that we look for perpetually now in America. Ironically, despite many decades rightfully thinking about Vietnam, there's been a shift in how we think of him. He didn't think of his power that way. And it's remarkable to hear him talk about how limited the window was going to be for him to do anything. He was very cognizant of the power of Congress, and he came out of the House and Senate, and so understood that committee chairs could cause all the problems in the world when they were ready to cause him those problems. And so a lot of these calculations have to really be understood through the mindset of a president who thought he might he writes a schedule early in his presidency about how much time he's going to have. He goes month by month, and he shows his advisors, and it's fleeting by 66. He says, I'm going to be done by the first midterms. And so I think it's counterintuitive to how we think of Lyndon Johnson. We think of the treatment with him hovering over people saying, do this, do that. But in fact, he thought about it very differently. And so these calculations were not desperate, but a kind of a fleeting sense of how long this window was going to last. And he was right.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I wanted to talk about next. It's like we didn't plan this, but that political prowess, because you're right, people talk about it, it is legendary. And you're right, we also did hear a lot about be more like LBJ. And what I'm curious about, because there's the cajoling, there's the relentlessness, there's the bullying, there's the use of his physical presence, and you were talking about the mischief that committee chairs can make. Before I ask a question, I do want to play another clip. And this is a conversation between Johnson and Appropriations Chairman George Mahon of Texas. He represented a district that included Lubbock. And Johnson is trying to get Mahon to do something he wants him to do. We could just play this one.
Mr. President. Hello, George. I wished I could afford to just go out and play golf all afternoon.
I shot a 79 today.
Oh, God. Well, that shows that you're not tending your work.
That's the first time I've done it this year.
That shows you're not tending your work, George.
That's right.
Well, now, listen, what I got to get you to do, I got to get you to help me on my poverty. Albert, this damned Albert Thomas now, said he's going to follow me on. I got 195 votes. Now, I have counted you, and I've counted Thomas. Now, somebody saw Thomas today, and Thomas said, well, I've been thinking about this thing, and I just believe I'll follow my chairman. And I'll get you the money, but I just have to follow my chairman, and he hadn't made up his mind.
Well, I'll be very quiet. I make no statement.
I know it, but I got to have you unquiet. And you bail me out of this one, and I'll try not to have you bail me out anymore. I'll be bailing you all out.
All right.
And anything you got to be bailed out on, I'll move the Navy to Lubbock, or I'll do anything you need done, whatever it is. That's the way I operate. I'm a Mahon man, and you can't do anything that I can do that I won't do.
Well, I'll be in touch with you.
All right, goodbye.
You can imagine getting those calls all the time. This goes to the point, the point we were just talking about. To what extent was the prowess and Johnson's magic, was that myth? Was it fact? Was it a little bit of both? Was it circumstance? I mean, let's talk about him as the master legislator.
I mean, it's historians always will give you the answer. It's a little of both. So you can just assume that's coming. And I think it is a little of both. He clearly had a lot of prowess, and more importantly, he had a sense of the political institutions and how they worked, because he was someone who spent so much time in Washington and had deep relations and had been through these battles before. But it's also a myth in terms of you don't really understand the Great Society without understanding the '64 election and the huge majorities that they produced, liberal, balancing the Democrats toward the liberal side. What year? That tape was what year?
It was she was trying to move Medicare.
Okay, so it's probably 65. Mahon's interesting because after the 66 midterm elections, in 67 and 68, when the conservative coalition has regained its power because of the midterms, Mahon and Wilbur Mills are no longer very subservient to the president and spend the last 2 years forcing him to cut spending if he wants to keep paying for Vietnam. And Johnson can't do that much about it. The conversations change very much. He's no longer the driver. And there's one quote that I don't remember the exact quotation, maybe Guian does, where he's being asked, I think by maybe Abe Ribicoff or something about why he can't get more money for a liberal program, and he says, you know, why can't you do this? You're the master of the Senate. And Johnson gets mad. He goes, I'm not the master of the Senate. I'm not the master of any damn thing that Congress doesn't want to do for me. And so I think the myth forgets how important that 65 to 67 period with these huge majorities was to allowing him to do this, even with all his skill. Once that goes away with the midterms, you know, he's facing the same problems President Obama faced in 2011 and other presidents have faced as well.
Yeah, that I'm not the master of anything line comes up a couple of times. In fact, when we look ahead to 1968 and his decision not to run, it's a wild period because there'll be moments of confidence and he's plotting out strategy for getting the nomination. And then there's this moment, he's trying to get a tax bill through Congress. And it's clear it's not going to happen, and he uses that exact line. And it's either that night or maybe the next day when he does the famous speech of "I will not, seek nor accept the nomination." But yeah, it's a little of both. The good historian here. Think about what Obama could have done with those kinds of majorities had he had the chance. We'd be talking about him as master legislator. That said, there is a level of skill here, and it does help to have somebody with that understanding of the nuances of how to move legislation, the committee process, and the individuals. One of his motivations in setting up the taping system was actually to manage information. The idea was that he could come back to a transcript of a conversation months later and be able to pull up a detail of what a congressman or an aide or somebody had said to him and use it strategically. And that's the kind of operator that Johnson was. And while the circumstances are absolutely necessary to have that kind of strength in Congress for that short window, it was really significant to have somebody like Johnson in office to push the specifics.
And Johnson relied on the movement. He relied on the movement, I think, as Julian said earlier, to create pressure from the grassroots in sort of creating a more conducive environment for change. And then, obviously, the strong majorities in Congress were very important. And it really, Johnson had help. He had allies in Congress like Adam Clayton Powell, who was the longtime African-American congressman from Harlem, who was the chair of the Labor and Education Committee. And Powell was basically responsible for, shepherding some 50 items of Great Society legislation through Congress. So, Johnson certainly was a formidable political force, but we can sort of exaggerate that and lose sight of all of the help that he had, the allies, the moderate leaders in the civil rights movement who really were able to sort of defeat challenges from the more militant wing of the civil rights movement at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. So Johnson certainly was reliant on, as you said, really ultimately reliant on support from Congress.
And he can't get Medicare in 64, as we said earlier, you mentioned earlier. He actually tries. He has a huge push, and it's killed. And in fact, Wilbur Mills says it's not happening. Kills it in conference committees. This is not happening. And then in 65, not only are more Democrats clamoring for it, but most Republicans all of a sudden are calling for their version of health care. So you can see, within the span of a few months, how an election kind of allowed him to use the skills that he had.
Well, as we talk about all of these programs, and there's so many more, the list is really striking. One of the things that I think about is what this means in the legacy in terms of federalism and the relationship between society and government, between people and government. And when, just before we came in and you all heard that trailer, you heard Josh Seitz, another historian, go through the list. Close your eyes and can you imagine? No Head Start, no A to K through 12 education. He goes on and on and on. And he makes the point that the Great Society fundamentally changes the way citizens relate to their government. And before I go to a question, one last clip. There's a period, and you've already alluded to it, Julian, leading that first Medicare battle. And Ronald Reagan then is just starting to make his way in politics. He had been a New Deal Democrat. He's made the shift. And this is what he says in that Medicare battle. Play this.
What can we do about this? Well, you and I can do a great deal. We can write to our congressmen, to our senators. If you don't, this program, I promise you, will pass just as surely as the sun will come up tomorrow. And behind it will come other federal programs that will invade every area of freedom as we have known it in this country. Until one of these days, you and I are going to spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it once was like in America when men were free.
It is wildly popular and gets played over and over and over and over. This is a real friction point in American culture and American politics, and I'm wondering, when did the backlash against government begin?
I mean, in some respects, it's always there. You know, this has been a thread. How far back do you want to take it? And that's reflected in
Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Constitution itself. So it's always there, and I think that's what Reagan is expressing. That is really coming out to some extent of the Goldwater campaign. That's a little earlier, but that movement is very much there, animating the Goldwater activists in '64. And it's worth noting that the AMA's opposition to Medicare generates its own backlash in that period, that they lose public support and are increasingly seen as an interest group that is concerned only about their own financial situation. And you start to see the elderly organizing against it, and support for the AMA's position as this neutral arbiter of what is medically necessary really erodes during this period. So there's a tense relationship all through this time period. I think the sort of obvious answer to how this changes is the combination of Vietnam and then Watergate, really leading to a tremendous damage to the public's faith in government.
Yeah. I mean, before you all go on, I think to that point, if you look at some of the Pew Research during the Johnson administration, generally average was about 76% or so of the American public to the low 80s saying, I trust government. Today it's about 17%. So even though, and I completely agree with you, that this has been a friction point in America since America, but something else happened or something else was built upon.
It was telling that you played that clip by Reagan, because the 1964 campaign with the Goldwater campaign, I think, is a moment in which these anti-government ideas really sort of get national exposure. Of course, Goldwater is defeated in a landslide by Johnson, but Goldwater was opposed to civil rights. He was opposed to government programs and equated them with socialism, and he was sort of deeply challenging the sort of the New Deal consensus of the bipartisan consensus of American politics. And of course, Reagan was maybe Goldwater's strongest supporter during the campaign, and obviously, sort of took up the mantle.
I think there's two ways to think about it. One is the notion this was simply a liberal era of American politics. I think it's just not true. And if you really look at the broad landscape of American life in the 60s, there's a lot of pretty strong sources of conservatism, Ronald Reagan being one of them. In Congress, the weight of power most of the 50s and 60s is in this conservative coalition, which really wasn't very embracing of issues like civil rights. And Johnson, like the limits of presidential power, was always obsessed with this as well. He hated when his advisors were just talking about all the things they could do, and he heard liberals say, why don't we do X, Y, and Z? Because he always would remind them of just how powerful the conservative currents of the country were. And there's one moment where the first teach-in takes place about Vietnam, and this is relevant to Vietnam. And someone says, you know, there was, I think it was at the Ann Arbor one, that there's a teach-in in Ann Arbor about Vietnam. Is this going to be a problem? I think it's Dean Rusk says it or something. And Johnson says, forgive my language, but I'm just, you know, he says, I don't give a shit. I don't care what those little shits on the college campus do. The real beast in this country is the reactionary right. And this also is really important. He was constantly fearful in politics of just how powerful conservatism was, and I think that's accurate. So we have to remember in the 60s, all of this is very much part of the world Johnson sees. And then the second thing, but then Vietnam and Watergate kind of provide a huge body blow to the kind of liberal arguments that did exist and did hold sway in parts of the public, and a conservative movement that takes form with Reagan in the head after the 70s capitalizes on this and kind of brings us to where you are.
Describing some of the benefits, maybe not all of them, but many of them, of the Great Society get pocketed by the American culture and American society. Medicare being, I think, one of the most significant, leading to those signs, you know, tell the government to keep its hands off my Medicare. And you see that tension between active, bold government and at the same time keep the, if you all, looking at today and looking at the debate that we're having as we head into a 2020 election, have liberals, progressives lost the argument on this idea of a positive view of an active government?
I think that the challenges that Americans and the world, you know, face today really, I think, create the conditions for a return to that sort of bold, ambitious sense of liberalism. I think out of a sense of necessity, these crises of inequality and climate change need to be met, and the stakes are incredibly high. And you know, add to that the additional stakes of the survival of the republic as we know it and the survival of democracy. So I think that liberals really have you know, sort of fertile conditions for, you know, articulating a really robust commitment to government action. Let's hope that that there's a willingness to sort of assume that kind of idealistic perspective.
And I think that, you know, it's the same mistake to think of the 60s simply as a liberal era and mistake the power of conservative politics. It's also a mistake now to say this is just still the era of Reagan to Trump and miss the continued power of liberal ideas and policies in this country. And the same polls that ask, do you trust government or not, and often show Americans don't trust government, look very different when you ask about specific programs. And many Republicans are not particularly eager now to say, let's repeal ACA. They kind of learned their lesson early. There are many who would like to, but there's a lot of support for the program. There's been a lot of support for Medicaid expansion. A lot of the Great Society is now so ingrained that the conservative liberal debates don't cover that. That's just assumed that it will continue. And so that great moment where you had Tea Party protesters telling President Obama, you know, don't get your government hands off my Medicare, and it always causes a laugh, but it actually is really a kind of illuminating moment that even in some of the most conservative parts of the country, a lot of these policies are the status quo, and Josh is right. It's hard to imagine, I think, for a lot of the country removing them. So I think there's a potential, not simply because of problems that require government and markets can't solve, but actually there is a lot of support in our daily lives for things that government does all the time, including an institution such as this.
Yeah, you know, there's always a tendency to kind of you know, think about history as something that you know, has a narrative arc to it with a nice conclusion, and we write our books that way. And I'm trying to convince my editor now I don't need a conclusion. I can just keep that. I don't think it's going to work. But I think that sort of affects the way we think about history, that it should have these tight periods with a beginning and an end, and in fact it never ends, and it's always in ferment, and that's where I think we are right now for a lot of the reasons that we've highlighted. That this is a period where there's this, I think probably kicked off by the financial crisis 10 years ago, where a lot of the certainties that we all grew up with and seem to be very fixed 15 years ago no longer are. We don't know how that's going to play out, other than it's now another time of upheaval.
Well, before we turn to you all for your questions, so start thinking about what you want to ask, my final question to you all is, what is the legacy of all of this? The legacy of the Great Society and LBJ's that intensive and successful efforts during that particular period?
I think to some extent it's that, as Julian has alluded to, the window is short, and you have to make choices. You have to take the options that are available while they can be accomplished. The need for pragmatism within a context of ambition is central to any viable political platform. And there may be a time for that overarching ambition, but there's a point where you've got to get down to the political bargaining.
And just to follow up on that, I think the ambition can get you in a lot of trouble. I think that LBJ's downfall, of course, was that he tried to fight two wars simultaneously, a war on poverty and the war in Vietnam. And that was just clearly untenable, and it squandered all of the sort of the political will and support. It left him open to attacks from the anti-war movement, from the civil rights leaders like Dr. King. So I think that obviously we need to think about the relationship of a domestic agenda for change and foreign policy and foreign entanglements overseas.
And I would conclude, I agreed with both. It's the same Johnson who gets us into Vietnam as gets us the Great Society, and we can't disentangle the two. Same instincts, actually. But I would conclude, and I know this goes against a book that's out there now on the Great Society, I think it is, like the New Deal, it has a legacy of what government can do in this country. And sure, there are problems, and some of the programs didn't work very well, or some of the programs didn't work as intended. But when you look back at the record of the problems that were seen in the 60s, and some of what was solved through this kind of robust response, it is remarkable. And whether you're talking about what voting rights kind of achieved until the Supreme Court just undid a few years ago a key part of it, to the way Medicare alleviated the problem of elderly health care in a way that we had it before '64, where it just wasn't there, to programs like Head Start, which so many people count on. Its legacy is about the kind of positive contributions of government in our history. And I think I'll always keep coming back to that the more that I study it.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I want to turn to you all now and raise your hand if you have a question and wait for the mic to come. And let me also say this. As I mentioned before, this is being recorded for a 7th episode in the podcast series. If you don't want to find yourself in the middle of a podcast series, just state that before you ask your question, because the magic of editing will take care of that. So please raise your hand. Yes.
To the historians, what would have happened had President Kennedy not been assassinated?
Oh my goodness. I like to use counterfactual questions in my teaching sometimes, but not very often. I think that Hollywood screenwriters and auteurs like Oliver Stone have weighed in on these kinds of questions, I suppose. But it seemed pretty clear that Kennedy was, LBJ had inherited the war on poverty from Kennedy. And this was a moment in which the face of poverty in the United States was multiracial, or shall we say, there was a lot of emphasis on poor white people in Appalachia. And, you know, as part of the backlash to LBJ and the Great Society, the face of poverty, you know, transformed and became African American. And my sense, I mean, this is a very sort of a tentative claim, but, you know, I do think that the anti-poverty agenda under a second term of JFK would have continued along those lines, and it would have been a much more sort of progressive, multiracial, sort of social democratic agenda for change. That's just a speculation, obviously.
Okay. Why don't we take the question? The person has a mic in the back.
Does the Great Society happen without the change or the shift in the media, the television?
I think, I mean, the media is very important in different parts of the Great Society, and I use the term to include the civil rights agenda. So certainly with civil rights, television has a powerful impact, and it's the ability of more of the country to actually see what's happening, both the conditions of African Americans, but also the violent response that's taking place to the protesters, whether it was in Birmingham in '63 or Selma in '65. And it has an effect. It has an effect on White House. If Richard Goodwin writes about watching Selma on TV in the White House and just kind of being, you know, terrified and horrified about what was going on. And then print reporters are really quite important at bringing all the stories that help build the support for these different policies. There's lots of stories about inadequate facilities for schools, for example, kids learning in trailers because there's too many kids and not enough schoolhouses, or what it meant to be old in America in '64 and have a health care problem. I found lots of great stories that I think were important in major newspapers about what that meant. So just the both generational change of the media, technological TV change, I think it was quite important. It was also quite important to the backlash. It was important to how Vietnam plays out, but the media was central, and that's why Johnson famously, you know, had the networks running in his office. It was the Twitter of his day. He had an eye on what was going on and was very concerned about the coverage of what he was doing.
There was also a TV news series reporting on poverty in Appalachia during the formative stages of the War on Poverty that I wouldn't say was, there were too many influences shaping the War on Poverty. That's a more complicated story, but it was one of the factors raising awareness to create a political context where it actually made sense, at least in the short term, to declare a war on poverty, that was a rhetorical move that could actually work in 1964. One factor among a number, but yeah, it meant something to be able to see, okay, what does it actually look like in an Appalachian Hollow to live that way? It shaped public perceptions.
Yeah, I mean, it was striking when we were doing research for the podcast, the degree to which so many Americans had no idea what was happening with regard to poverty. It was so distant from them at a time where the economy was doing well and there was this sense of prosperity. So bringing that into people's living rooms was critical. Take a question over here and then we'll move across the room. Yes.
I'd like to get your comments on what happened to the two-party system and how aware the Southern Democrat was on losing the Southern Democrats with his embracement of the civil rights movement and maybe more specifically his personal dealings with his mentor, Senator Russell.
Well, Johnson knew after passing the Civil Rights Act, I think he told his aide, Bill Moyers, that we've probably lost the South to the Democratic Party for his lifetime and Moyers' lifetime as well. So I think he understood that he had sort of created conditions ripe for President Nixon and the Southern strategy of trying to woo disaffected white Southern Democrats to the Republican Party. And that's That's a real turning point. It really sort of transforms the Democratic Party into sort of a single party for civil rights instead of a sort of a split party with the segregationist Dixiecrat wing and sort of the northern pro-civil rights liberal Democrats. But I'm sure that my colleagues have other things to add to that.
I mean, I think that's absolutely true. We think of Johnson as the ultimate calculating politician, self-serving, but he often did things which weren't necessarily in the best interest, his own best interest or the party. The 64 story with Moyers is great in terms of capturing just the whether it's exactly what happened or not, it captures the clear risks of his putting his presidency behind this. And then it happens again. I always, in the fierce urgency of now, I ended up writing a lot about the battle over open housing bill from 66 to 68, which Johnson pushes forward. King has kind of moved to Chicago, and he's moved into a pretty dilapidated area as a way to say this is the next frontier of civil rights. Johnson pushes a bill, and it causes a fierce backlash in the North. In some areas that he counted on, and the Democrats counted on, like this will cost Paul Douglas, one of the key figures in civil rights, a senator, it will cost him his seat. He'll lose in 66 to Charles Percy. And Johnson will keep pushing this fair housing bill. It will get watered down, the enforcement mechanisms will go away, but he doesn't give up, and he's very aware of what the threat is. He is fueling the backlash. And so it's really interesting to think of Johnson. He's certainly not selfless, but he was willing to move into areas of policy that had big political risks. And I think on civil rights, it wasn't simply the South. He understood that in the North, this backlash was brewing too, that we continue to see right through this day.
I'm glad you highlighted the Fair Housing Act, because that's something we often sort of treat as an afterthought to the Great Society, and both in its limitations and what it did accomplish. It's actually really, really significant piece of legislation. John, the shifts in the Republican Party, though, are underway that are really profound at this point, too, and really important. Alluded to Johnson being aware of that, and there's a fascinating conversation in the winter or spring of '68 where he's talking to Nelson Rockefeller, the liberal governor of New York, and strongly encouraging him to get into that race and challenge Nixon. And you never know exactly with Johnson what his motivations really are. There's almost an illusion that he'd rather have Rockefeller than Humphrey win, but there's also that strong sense of he knew what Nixon represented even by that point.
A question in the very
Thank you. This has been very, very illuminating. My question is, did anyone back then ever question who was going to pay for all this, as we do now with health care for all? Maybe the economy was doing well, I don't know, but did anyone ever think about that?
Oh, yeah. All the time, all the time. I mean, the question of paying for programs is front and center. In the early days of the Johnson presidency, in the latter days, Johnson is not only thinking about it, but he's always under pressure from members of Congress. And he's constantly, early on, emphasizing that a lot of these programs will either be self-financed, like Medicare, through the Social Security tax, or that they would be cheap. Ultimately, the war on poverty is not very robust in terms of the funding, because in '64, he understands he's not going to get a lot of money. Harry Byrd is the head of the Senate Finance Committee and basically gets him to agree to a pretty stringent budget. So those costs in the heyday of the Great Society are very much being discussed. Who's going to pay for this? And then in the last part of his presidency, in the last couple of years, as we discussed a little earlier, finance it's one of the biggest issues he's dealing with. How are you going to pay for the war on poverty, the Great Society in Vietnam? And members of Congress are saying you have to choose between guns or butter, and it leads to this kind of huge conflict where Johnson ultimately concedes. But cost is never absent from the political debate. Oh yeah, but not as much as the 1980s would. In fact, because Johnson was both understanding that the tax writing committees and people like Mahon were going to limit what he could do, a lot of these programs are just not as voluminous financially as you would see in terms of other administrations and their spending.
But you know, this is a different era. This is an era of growth liberalism.
Right.
The economy is still expanding, and you know, there isn't this sense of limits. There's a sense that economic growth is going to sort of resolve those kinds of questions. And Johnson is acutely aware of the need to sort of bring along members of Congress who don't, you know, who are opposed to spending. I mean, he would argue that the war on poverty was going to sort of relieve middle-class taxpayers of the burden of supporting poor people. But you know, the period of economic crisis in the early 1970s and stagflation and all of that is just ahead, and that really, I think, imposes this sense of limits. But when Johnson was president, there's a sense that affluence would sort of resolve all of these issues.
And Vietnam drives the deficits much more than the domestic programs. I mean, that's where the deficits are coming from, and that's where the out-of-control spending actually happens.
Yeah.
Just two things to add to that. You know, one is Johnson, that I would emphasize, Johnson's own fiscal conservatism. He was personally, I would argue, focused on maintaining a balanced budget, and that's a constant refrain in his conversations. Kevin kind of alluded to this, but there's something we haven't talked enough about, and that's the economic policy that's actually undergirding, an economic theory that's undergirding much of the Great Society. My former colleague Dave Shreve is in the audience, who wrote his dissertation about this, but there's a whole new approach and a refinement of Keynesian theory that goes on in the late 50s and into the 60s. It's embodied by Walter Heller, who is Kennedy and Johnson's chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. And this is kind of the great era of expertise, and there is a belief that this is something that can be managed, that you can stimulate the economy with spending or tax cuts, as they pass in late 63 when you need to, but then you can dial it back and manage inflation through tax increases. That shockingly becomes the rub with Congress as we get into the later part of the 60s. Dave, if you're interested, can take you through all of the nuances of this, but this is, I think, really critical to understanding the sort of intellectual underpinnings and the theoretical underpinnings, the effort that economists like Heller are making to convince Kennedy and Johnson that, in fact, you know, this is something that you can manage through appropriate fiscal policy in particular.
Thank you very much. This is great. Also, it mirrors to me what's happening right now. So people are right now in the legislation passing all these bills because we're sort of speed dialing all the issues because of the amount of people that we voted in. And so my question to you is, do you think then that we'll succeed in this window of opportunity like we did in the Great Society, so to speak, in '64, from what you're telling me, because of key people like Reverend Berber and Al Gore and certainly Bloomberg and Bernie talking about specific, you know, monies going to different causes and that sort of thing. Do you think this is going to be the same window at this point? And also, can you do your podcast to the Congress? I mean, can you invite them in on your podcast? Because I think you're so on the mark, you know, with what you're doing. Thank you.
My answer is elections have consequences. We're seeing that in Richmond right now, where Governor Northam is empowered to pursue the most progressive legislative agenda certainly in decades or ever in Virginia. And that's the result of what has happened in the last two state elections. At the federal level, there's no window until after the election and dependent on its outcome for a kind of ambitious liberal agenda.
Yeah, this window, we are not in a window like the 64. That's my answer. I mean, we have a Senate Majority Leader who is quite committed to opposing anything you're hearing from the Democratic campaign, from Biden to Bernie. And who has pretty tight control over his caucus and is not going to budge. You have a lot of pretty powerful conservative forces in the country that are still very much actively going to put pressure against any of these kinds of ideas. And you have a president now who, for all his unconventional, out-of-the-box kind of methods, is still pretty aligned with the conservative movement in terms of these kinds of issues. So things really need to change if this is not simply going to be a flourishing of progressive ideas, but actually a moment of progressive politics akin to the mid-1960s. We're still far away from that. I do think, though, there are a lot of lessons from this period that we have kind of gone through, and the one that keeps coming back is both the need to change the configuration of power in Congress, not just the White House, and the centrality from day one of Johnson's presidency, of that civil rights movement, in changing what the conventional wisdom was in Washington. Without those, you can't get the window that you're talking about.
Yeah. Sid Milkis, who's also a professor of politics here and a Miller Center faculty member, talks about and writes extensively about social movements and the relationship between social movements and the presidency, and how those two things are intertwined, as Julian just said. Next question. Mike is coming your way.
I came here thinking Vietnam is strictly off limits, but it's been mentioned several times. What happened to the narrow window masterful president with regard to the Great Society when it came to Vietnam? The quagmire of Vietnam is the polar opposite. Public pulse and so on and so forth. And after all, as you said, the economic deficits were driven by Vietnam, and to, I would imagine, a large extent, the Great Society was greatly undermined by Vietnam. So they're not extricable.
Yeah, it's the same dynamics at work. And so part of the Vietnam story, as everyone has learned, is clearly the domino theory and the way policymakers thought about how communism would spread, and a kind of blindness to what was going on. But part of it all the time, Johnson was very scared. He was a generation that in the 50s saw Republicans could do pretty well on national security issues. I always tell people the 1952 election is actually really important in understanding Johnson, because that's when Eisenhower won. That's when Republicans retook control of Congress on issues like communism and Korea. And Johnson's haunted by this, and he's very scared that the window, which is already small, will be even smaller if he and the Democrats are not tough on national security and don't respond to the argument that they wouldn't be aggressive enough to the threat that was being claimed in Vietnam. And so it's the same, I said that earlier, it's the same instincts. And you hear this again and again, and when people close to him like Richard Russell are saying on the tapes, this is going to be a big disaster. There's no way this is going to go well. The tapes, as everyone who's heard them, are unbelievable. You know, Richard Russell sounds like an anti-war protester, and he's as hawkish as they get. But Johnson says, what am I going to do? They'd impeach me in the parts of the country you're from if I withdrew from this battle. And so I think it's the same political instincts that lead him into this massive, catastrophic mistake. And I come back to the argument, you don't separate the two. It's not but Vietnam or and Vietnam. It's Vietnam is very much part of the mix, and it leads to his undoing.
And that's in '64.
Yeah, that's in '64.
This is in '67 when it's all unwinding. This is early on. They see this. That's the tragedy.
And Humphrey has this great, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's okay.
I mean, Humphrey has a great memo in '65, which everyone should read, that he's vice president, and he writes Johnson, he says, you just won this huge landslide. Goldwater's basically discredited the entire Republican Party in one swoop. And so use this window to get out. Get out of Vietnam, withdraw, and put your energy in all these domestic programs you care about. It's an amazing memo, and Johnson's response was to push Humphrey out of his inner circle and have him not talk to him about Vietnam anymore, because he doesn't agree with that calculation. But you can see early on, the warnings are all there.
and the war on poverty and the war in Vietnam are actually inextricably linked in that, you know, the escalation of ground troops was seen, you know, by the Defense Department as an anti-poverty program. Project 100,000 was prioritizing, drafting, enlisting black men to serve disproportionately in the war. And so, you know, that's kind of the underside of the war on poverty. But Johnson really didn't see any way out of this sort of long-standing Cold War consensus of, you know, the need to contain communism wherever it was.
Let's put this in context, too. This is a president who, as they are actually drafting the details of the war on poverty, rejects a proposal from Secretary of Labor Willard Wirtz to do a job creation program, actual direct creation of jobs to employ young men. But then they do this, you know, a year and a half later.
Yeah, and he
to
saw
get them off of whatever it was, welfare rolls, to train them.
Yeah, he saw it as the antithesis of the job creation that took place during the New Deal, and he was like, economy's doing well, we don't have to do that. This isn't a handout. We're never going to do a handout.
Yeah.
And then
sending them to Vietnam.
Right,
Okay.
right. And the continued fraying of his relationship with Dr. King, who was just infuriated. I mean, we all know where Dr. King stood on the war, but he saw this as a direct hit on the war on poverty and trying to implement the civil rights legislation that had been passed. So with that, we're going to need to bring this to a close. I do want to thank a few additional people. One, if you are with the Miller Center, if you could help put this event together, please raise your hand. I see some people, in the back. I would like to thank my colleagues at the Miller Center for all the work that they've done time and time again putting these events together, so thank you. And also Steve Atlas, who is the executive producer of the podcast. I want to thank you, and Derek John, who couldn't be here, who wanted to be, had illness in his family, who's a senior producer. So thank you so much for your work on this as well. And again, thank you all for coming, and help me thank this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful panel. And the last thing I will